difficulty, one of loss, and one of grief. Elimelech, the man who began this story, was a man who was subject to his times, the days when the judges ruled Israel and there was no king. These were days that were filled with war and violence and unrest and immorality in every sphere. And he led his family to Moab in violation of God's law. And after living there for around 10 years, give or take, he and his 2 sons died and left Naomi and her daughters-in-law in poverty. Naomi now has made her way back home. And in a surprising turn of events, Ruth remained with her on that road, choosing to leave her land, her religion, and her people behind, and instead turn her life over to Naomi, Naomi's people, and Naomi's God. So this morning we're going to find our focus as we look for these few moments of chapter 2, what happens in the life of this loyal woman who turned away from the broken ways of Moab and sought shelter on Israel's God. What did Ruth find in walking under Yahweh's wings? Well, first we find that in her poverty and distress, she will see the hand of provision. At the end of chapter 1, we're told that when Ruth and Naomi make their return to Bethlehem, they've arrived at the beginning of the season of the barley harvest. That puts the timeline somewhere around mid to late April, according to the scholars. And this is the time when the rainy season has finally passed, something that we in Mobile have no idea about how that feels because it's always the rainy season here. And after they returned, they found a place to stay, which was likely with the relatives of Elimelech or Naomi. And after they moved in, maybe a day or two later, they find we need food. So in verse 2, Ruth, being an industrious person, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field," and this is in verse 3, "and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." Now, Ruth did not just pull this idea out of thin air. This is in keeping with the Old Testament law of Moses, God's provision for the poor. This is actually out of the book of Leviticus, chapter 9. It says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather fallen grapes of your vineyard. But you shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God." This commandment is also given in Deuteronomy, though, when you're reading through in your yearly Bible plan, we can kind of rush over that. This is a very important law for us to consider because this was a way for the poor and sojourners to find provision for themselves and their families when they fell on hard times. It was a hand up that protected their life and their dignity. Now, Ruth, either through observation or hearing of this from her husband or Naomi, remembered this law, this principle, and sought to act on it so that she can care for her elderly mother-in-law. So why was this law given? It was to care for those who are like Ruth and Naomi, those who are in need. But it was also given to show something about the character of God. In it, we learn that God is not only interested in every detail of our lives, but also the details of the lives and people who we don't seem to notice. He's interested in the details and preservation of those who are less fortunate. God's heart is inclined toward the downcast and the outcast. He does not look over those who are in need, but instead, he takes special notice of them. And through the giving of this law, he called his people to do the same. Now, this principle is important for not only the people of Israel, it's important for us, even though it might look a little different for us in a non-agrarian culture, where the main way their economy functioned was with the production of crops. Ours is much different. And though the world has changed in the way it functions, the heart of God has not changed in regards to the poor, the needy, and the outcast. The people Jesus came to dwell among during his time on earth were predominantly made up of these kinds of people. the people that nobody wanted to be around, the people who were really struggling in hard economic times. Those were the people he surrounded himself with, and we're still surrounded by those people. And if we're not careful, it's so easy to become hardened or numb to it. Perhaps we may need to pray that God, through the Holy Spirit, would open our eyes to notice His people, to see Him as He does, that He would give us the heart of God for them, that we too could find a way together to care for them, to lift them up and preserve their dignity as image bearers of God in our world. There's some ways our church is involved in doing this. We have the work with the homeless that Elizabeth Chiplich leads. We have Driftwood Housing Project that Chuck and some others are involved with. These are ways that maybe we can have a hand in caring for the Naomis and Ruths of this world, just as God cares for them. So Ruth is going in search of provision for them both, and she's looking for a place where she can find favor. Now, I kind of wonder if this statement is maybe functioning as a prayer, praying that God would lead her to where she needs to be. Naomi, it seems to be kind of still dragged down in that dark place that she was in chapter 1, and she just, in effect, says, go ahead, do what you want. And we pick up with Ruth. It says, so she went, she came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As Ruth is seeing where to go, she ends up in this particular field. She probably followed a train of workers who were all heading for the harvest, because the harvest was an all hands on deck kind of situation. Everyone was in the field working. And when they would go out to harvest, the way that they would do this is pretty interesting. They'd grab a handful, they'd take the sickle, and they'd cut it. And then when they would cut it, when their arms were too full to hold more, they would set it on the ground and they'd move toward the next bundle. And the people would come behind and they'd tie up these bundles to be stored later, and they would move forward. And what the Ruth and the poor would do, they come behind after those bundles were picked up, and they pick up what's left, and they would take it and work on it themselves for their families. These will always be very small pieces too. This is somewhat equivalent to someone who's going around collecting tin cans from soft drinks and hoping to make some money back on them. It's a hard way to make a very basic living. And this harvest was a big event. She had no trouble finding a place to glean, and she could hardly have expected to be in exactly the right field at exactly the right time. This field is a place where she will indeed find an answer to that prayer. She will find favor and grace lavished on her, and it will be more than she could possibly imagine. Because under the wings of God, Ruth has found favor and provision straight from Yahweh's hand. But she also in this field finds His hand of protection. At the end of verse 3, we see that this wasn't just any field, but as it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And this is where the plot thickens. See, verse 1 gave us a little peek at Boaz, as Leland read to us, and it says that he was a prominent, rich man of the family of Elimelech. Other translations describe him as a man of standing. He had status in the city of Bethlehem. Later in the story, we see that he's at the city gates, which is something like the country club of Bethlehem. And as Ruth is working in this field, we get a more formal introduction to Boaz. He arrives at the field and greets him, and he says, "The Lord be with you." Clearly, he was an Anglican. Then he begins to ask the question, who is that young woman over there? It's possible he noticed her because she was gleaning, and it's also possible that he noticed her because she was a Moabite, and therefore looked a little different from the other workers. So his foreman in the field explains the situation to Boaz, and it seems as if Boaz's heart is moved, and he says to her, "Now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." And he has two instructions for her here. He instructs her first, stay in this field. Likely, okay, if you were to take a wide angle look at the field she's working in, this farmland, you'd find that the fields are all right up against each other. The boundaries of these fields were piles of rocks that delineated who owned which field. And when someone was gleaning, the best idea would be to go from field to field to get as much as you possibly can, because everyone is harvesting at this time. But for Ruth, that wasn't a very good option. That would put her at risk, because she may enter into a field in which she cannot find favor, to where she would not be received and even taken advantage of in some way. And the writer, because the writer keeps reminding us, Ruth is a Moabite. She doesn't belong among the Israelites. There's a possibility she wouldn't be treated well because she was an outsider. Because of her ethnic difference, she was open to mistreatment. And Boaz knew that possibility. And he took measures to ensure her protection. First, he told his boys to leave her alone. And he told Ruth to stay close to the women. And this is interesting, just a thought, because as an outsider, maybe this is something she couldn't assume that she was allowed to do. She may have had to keep some distance from those women. But Boaz invites her in with them, treating her just like he would an Israelite, reaching across those ethnic lines. You know, how much better would our world be if maybe that was something we were all practicing regularly? Ruth, in response to this, bows down to the ground in thankfulness, and she asks him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" Boaz said he heard what happened with Naomi. This was probably family news. He was in the same family circles. And out of gratefulness and admiration, he says, "May the Lord reward you for what you've done." In a sense, saying, you've shown faithfulness and favor to Naomi. Now I want to extend that to you as a down payment on what God will give you. And may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. The protection that Boaz has offered her is another way that God's heart is shown. You see, throughout the Bible, we find again and again, God extends his protection to his people, ushering them out of hardship, out of suffering, under his sheltering wings, like a hen gathering up her chicks to protect them. This is a love that God has for his people, a place of refuge from the hardships of this world and its broken systems. And by joining herself to Naomi and Yahweh, Ruth, though a foreigner, once outside the camp, has been brought in by the Lord. And Boaz is seeing her as coming under the protective wings of God over Israel, and he welcomes her. How would it look if we could do this? How would our social circles change? How would our worship services look? How would our fellowship time in the parish hall? Our life groups? How would they all be different if we found a way to reach across those divides, those different divides that we've imposed on ourselves, and welcomed in those who may not be welcome in other places, who may not be accepted by other groups of people, but who've come and want to seek refuge and shelter under the wings of God? What would our witness be to those who are downcast and outcast if we adopted this mindset? Again, it would probably look a little different from this. Well, probably a lot different, unless there's any farmers in the room. Just like before, we have to ask, what if we ask the Spirit to show us what this would look like, to take notice of the outsider who's come to seek shelter, the one who's wandering and needs a refuge? I wonder, what would God do? Under God's wings, Ruth found provision in spite of poverty. She's found protection in the face of racial tension. And finally, she's going to see the hand of God moving as the hand of providence. At the end of the day, after a brief meal break, Ruth gathers up her gleanings, takes them over to the threshing floor, and there she would beat out the grain and pile it together to make it easier to carry and wrap up to take home. It says that she had an ephah, which is roughly 29 U.S. pounds, which is pretty impressive amount of grain. This was due in part to Boaz's command to his workers to drop a little extra in the field for her to gather up. And Ruth put her all into this task. And that's an honorable thing to notice. And she brings it home to show Naomi, and Naomi is shocked. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked?" That's the same question twice, and she's really interested. It's a wait, what? Where did this come from? Who did this come from type of question. She says, "Blessed is the man who took notice of you." And so Ruth tells her where she worked and where she got it. She says, "The name of the man with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "That man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." The news that Boaz was the one that showed favor to Ruth caused this light to go on in Naomi's mind. It says he's one of their nearest kin, or one of their redeemers, which is a really big concept that don't have time to get into this week. But basically, what to say, this represents a way for them to regain what has been lost. And those of you who know how the story works out, we can hear the wheels spinning in Naomi's head already. Though before all she could see was the hand of God moving against her, now she sees the hand of God moving with Ruth. Because what Ruth found under the wings of God was his hand at work. It wasn't by chance that she wandered into Boaz's field. It wasn't sheer luck that he knew who she was and knew of Naomi. It wasn't an accident that she would find favor and protection as she sought to provide for her mother-in-law. This was the result of the work of God going before her to provide for his people. This is something of a comfort for us, isn't it? Today, as we seek our provision, I dare say most of us are pretty much aware that our income doesn't really go as far as it used to. It's a little stretched. We know how it feels to be stretched. Those on fixed incomes and families are now struggling more to adjust their budget to keep food on the table and a roof above their heads. It's a very sobering time. But God does provide. He doesn't necessarily say that you won't have to work for it a little bit, but he does provide. Ruth and Naomi, though they're in extreme poverty, have nothing. But God already directed a way to provide their needs. His covenant love for his people will always go before you as well. And he calls you to trust him. We also can see how we need his protection, especially over these last few years. Maybe some people have a little hesitation about going out these days between sickness and civil unrest and rising crime rates. It seems like it's impossible not to be a little bit concerned. But you don't need to be overly worried. God has his wings over you, and nothing can befall you that's outside of his knowledge. We sang Psalm 91 this morning, and that's a psalm of protection. And it may be a good habit for you to pray that psalm if you are experiencing that kind of fear, to memorize it, to treasure it in your heart, and bring it out when those trying times come, when that fear and anxiety come. And maybe you'll find when you look up, you'll see his wings over you, in which you can take shelter. Ruth found protection and provision in that place in the palm of his hand. She found welcome into the family of God when she was an outsider, and you can too. I don't take it for granted that we have to ask, are you under his wings? Are you a member of his covenant family? Has there been a time in your life when you left those broken ways of doing things and the gods of this world behind you, the world, the flesh, and the devil, and turned to him? Have you put your faith in the Lord who loves his people so much that he sent his Son to rescue them from their brokenness? If you haven't, I encourage you to come to him today, to turn to Jesus and take shelter under his arms. They were spread wide upon the cross and are open to all who will come to him. It wasn't just Ruth who was under God's wings, though. It was also Naomi. even though she couldn't really see it. The provision and protection that Ruth found also brought provision and protection to Naomi. But more than that, it's brought hope. And all of this was by design, by God's plan. Naomi, in her darkness, in her grief, looks at what has happened, and she can see the hand of God on the move, the light at the end of this ruined road. And this is cause for her to praise, even when her circumstances haven't changed. She's still in poverty. Her husband and sons are still gone, and they will not come back to her. But out of this darkness, she can see the blessing of God in the life of Ruth, and she can still rejoice. And that's probably the hardest lesson from this chapter this morning. Maybe you're in that place we talked about last week, that place where it's so dark and it seems as if the hand of the Lord is moving against you. You see the good things in this story, the good things in other people's lives, the provision that Yahweh gave to Ruth, the protection against any threat, the provision in other people's lives, the protection against calamity. And you got to ask, what good is that for me where I am? It's hard sometimes to take joy in God's goodness in the life of others when you're surrounded by darkness. It's hard to rejoice. I heard a pastor tell a story one time of this church. He just gotten there, and it was a church full of young families, and there were these two couples who struggled with infertility for years. They were unable to have children. And they grew very close together in their struggle because each one understood what they were going through. And they were in the same life group together. They were close friends, always talking and praying for each other. And in a prayer service that they were having one night, one of the couples comes forward and says, "We would like prayer. The Lord has given us a child. We're pregnant, and we want to pray that this pregnancy would be safe." And the whole room went quiet. And the pastor's looking over here to find someone to go pray for them, and he sees his hand waving on the other side of the room. And he looks over, and it's the husband of that other couple, the one who weren't able to have children. He said, "Pastor, I want to pray for my friend, that God would continue to be good to them, and they would deliver their child in safety." And the story is that when that man began to pray, he said it was one of the most difficult, sad, but joyful things he'd ever heard in his life. And there was not a dry eye in the room, and everyone left praising God for his goodness. That kind of thing can only come from the work of God, the Holy Spirit, in your life. It's not possible, humanly speaking, to take joy when you're in sorrow. There's no way that we in ourselves can get past that kind of resentment and hurt. But there is a way. And there is a place of refuge that you can take all of that pain and disappointment. There's a place where you can lay it all bare, where you can pour out the agony of your soul, where you can be as open and as honest as you need to be about what you're going through. There's a place you can find rest and joy again. There's a place where you indeed can rejoice, and you can only find it under the wings of God. Amen. Please stand and we will confess the Nicene Creed together.